Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Psychosocial Distancing Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Chadbourne, and with me is Thomas Brooks. How are you doing tonight, Thomas?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing, Daniel?
Oh, we're making it.
We're making it.
Gearing up for the start of the semester.
Oh yeah,
at,
August
at the
is
time
upon
of
us.
recording. So we're going to talk about attitude change or attitudes in general and kind of different facets. This is kind of a chapter that's got a little bit of everything, and maybe it's indicative of the problem of some social psych textbooks that just sort of throw everything in and try to string stuff together. But we're going to do our best to string it all together tonight. And so I want to start with a story about attitudes, or at least, kind of belief and understanding and perceptions that people have about the world. And then we can get into talking a little bit about attitude change and what are attitudes, or what kind of attitudes are there. So 538, which is the sort of popular polling site, it tracks elections and a number of other things, published an article a couple of days ago. So many Americans are convinced crime is rising in the U.S. They're wrong. But their fear makes everyone less unsafe, or less safe, not unsafe. And so there was there's been a survey, and then for 10 years, and then they've collected some data post this, but there was a 10-year-long survey, the National Survey of Economic Expectations, and it asked participants very specifically things like, will you get robbed this year? And so not might you, just will you, definitely. And then how would you rate your chances to get robbed? And what they could actually do is they could track people's perceptions of crime, their attitudes towards crime, and the likelihood that crime was going to happen, and track it with actual statistics, so actual crime statistics. So when they say that, one of the years, so across the decade, respondents put their chances of being robbed, and this doesn't include other forms of criminal activity, but their chances of being robbed at about 15% constant. Looking back, the actual rate of robbery in the United States was 1.2%. But again, that doesn't mean that it's impossible.
Right.
It doesn't mean that crime is zero, but comparatively, what people have guessed, and in the same thing actually happens, that in contrast with other economic measures, we actually tend to be fairly good at it. When asked their risk of upcoming job loss, people guessed it was about 14.5%, which might be very different if we're asking this February and April 2020.
Right.
But it was actually much closer to their actual rate of job loss, about 12.9%. So the people who said, I'm probably going to lose my job this year, we're pretty accurate. I mean, I think it's pretty easy for us to look at our day-to-day lives, our personal day-to-day lives, and be able to realize, maybe, in our case, maybe the university is doing cutbacks, maybe something extreme is going to happen, maybe my boss is angry, been angry a lot lately.
Maybe I felt weird at work for the past month.
Right. And it actually reminds me a lot of previous chapters discussion of like attribution theories. When we're making attributions about ourselves or understanding of ourselves, like we know this more. We have a better understanding of what we have experienced, what we know, what we have been through. And so something like our job is one thing, but crime, which is something that's going to rely on what other people do to us, that's more of that external attribution. And we don't know about other people. We don't know maybe accurately what's going on. And that further gets us into what we'll talk about a little later with, how the news and propaganda techniques, and we're entering an election year. So, election advertising tries to kind of portray, to kind of stoke aspects of this fear.
Right. That's something that I talk about in my intro classes a lot, because we kind of mull over why people think that it's more dangerous to be in America right now than at any other time, even though that's not necessarily true. And a lot of the time, students will just say, oh, it's the internet. The internet just bombards me with horror stories of what's going on all the time. And I'm like, yeah, no wonder.
I mean, I grew up in southern Louisiana and would watch the news every morning before I'd go to school when I was in high school with my dad, pre-mainstream internet days. pre-Twitter days. And yeah, there was a lot of that. Every time we'd watch the news, like, it's this murder that's going on in New Orleans. They wouldn't talk about anything positive. It's that if it bleeds, it leads. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what you're bombarded with. They found that according to a survey conducted by Gallup in 2019, about 64% of Americans believed that there was more crime in the US than there was a year ago. And it seems to be a pretty consistently held belief at about 50% more, Americans believing, and it's been going up since about the year 2000, than what we had a year ago. But as
Mm-hmm.
we kind of see an actual, like, property crime and violent crime since pre-2000 is almost into sort of the, per 1,000 households, into
Mm-hmm.
the tens per 1,000 households. Now, 300 million Americans. That does mean the news will
Quite a
always have
few.
something to report on. But we also see this severe decrease from property crime if we go back into, like, the 1990s, 1980s, being in the 400 per 1,000 plus,
Mm-hmm.
going down to, again, about 100, so about 10%, as opposed to 40, 50%. We have seen this consistent drop, but we still have this attitude, this belief that it's much worse than it actually is. And so this kind of gets us into types of attitudes, and the textbook goes over kind of the basic two sections, and I want to, I guess, focus on kind of both of these in different areas before we then move on to how they can be influenced. But we look at the first kind of three categories. I call them the ABCs of attitudes: affective, behavioral, and cognitive. So I would argue that a lot of these beliefs in crime being much worse than it is are much more likely to be affective attitudes. They're not
Mm-hmm.
based on any sort of logical thought. They're not based on behavior. I mean, maybe if you're committing crimes, you have a pretty good understanding of
Yeah, you
how many
probably
people
have a
you hit a
better
year.
idea.
Or if you happen to be that, that 1 out of 1,000 or 10 out of 1,000 who are affected by it, it's very likely that behavioral attitudes might play a part in this. If you've
Mm-hmm.
experienced it, if you've been a part of it, in the same way that we tend to view music that we listen to or hear a lot, or that they play constantly because they're paid to
Constantly.
play it constantly, it gets us to
Over and
like that
over.
music more. And they're very different than cognitive attitudes, or attitudes that we put a lot of thought in. If we're actually looking at the statistics, if we're trying to kind of understand what's going on, and how these attitudes form, can also help us. We get to sort of the end of this discussion about how we break them down. We actually find that effective attitudes are defeated with effective messaging. Behavioral
Mm-hmm.
attitudes are defeated by getting people to engage in different behaviors. And they talk about sticking with a diet is about building habits. You got to
Mm-hmm.
change your behavior to do it. Or cognitive attitudes, you're not gonna fool or change someone's mind with a rational, logical, that they've come to with a rational, logical, pathway with some sort of fear-based advertising.
Right.
On the
You got
flip
a
side, you're
logical
not
way
gonna,
out of it.
yeah, and you're not gonna change that person who's got that fear with a rational, logical discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And they've actually recently done a study on that as well, where they looked at, particularly, this was a couple of years ago, anti-vaxxers, and how to kind of have a kind of rational discussion. And they said, well, you kind of can't at first. You need to address their fears. In many cases, these are parents who are afraid of what they've heard, that something bad is going to happen to their kid. And as a
Mm-hmm.
parent, I'm overly afraid at all sorts of dumb things that I shouldn't be afraid of that might happen to my kid. So I can understand where that's coming from to a degree. But
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to be able to go up to him and go, here's all of the data, here's all of the rational, logical, intelligent, I don't want to say intelligent, but rational, logical reasoning that I've put into understanding why you're wrong. They're going to go, but my kid.
Right,
Fear is
exactly.
going to take hold.
So you need to address the fear first and then walk them through the logic.
Right. And I think that would be a problem too if you were to show someone who was part of that. I mean, we're talking large chunk of the United States that feels that things are worse. Crime is up. I have this, innate feeling, or I watch the news every night, or I'm
Mm-hmm.
bombarded with all of those messages. You're not going to be able to go up to them and say, hey, look at these graphs. This is why you're wrong.
Turns out feelings don't care about your facts.
Right. I say that constantly whenever I'm talking about almost any class. I say, look, I love the statement. I actually think, and I'm want to give credit where credit is due, but like I think the statement, like, we wish facts didn't care about your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But as social psychologists, we understand that your feelings can construct your reality.
Right. Yeah. No, your facts are meaningless without context.
Right. And so, how do you get someone to understand your facts? Well, you can't belittle them as much as you might want to. If you're having a really
Mm-hmm.
heated discussion, you can't put them down. You can't call them ignorant. You have to be able to address those fears first.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can open them up to some of those facts. You have to kind of get past the feeling barrier first.
Are you telling me that I need to treat people like humans?
Yes.
Oh.
Not many of us
the
want to
inter-
hear that.
the internet did not prepare me for
Might
that.
be a controversial statement. And yeah, and that'll actually get us. I mean, part of the reason why we have these barriers too, will get us to what we'll eventually talk about with some cognitive dissonance discussion. So how do we change our own attitudes through these conflicting thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
I know this is true, but I've suddenly been confronted with information that says otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of brings us to the second way attitudes are kind of broken down. And so outside of these methods in which we form attitudes, and I really like thinking about those two in relation of voting. We vote with our heart or our gut. We vote because we've always voted for Republicans or Democrats or independents, or we vote because we've carefully thought about our candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And out of the 30-40% of Americans who actually do go and vote, um, and in the 2016 election, I think it was about 45 to 50% of Americans went and voted, which is not the entire amount of people who could have voted.
Right.
And so,
And most of them
even
did it based on gut, right?
yeah, it's about a third of the people who actually do vote know absolutely nothing about the candidate they're voting for.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely nothing. And that includes presidential candidates that may have gotten a lot of screen time. They know absolutely nothing realistically about this person other than, like, there's something in my gut that tells me that this person is better than that person.
That reminds me of some of the studies that were done looking at like attractive faces and who's likely to win. And I wonder if it's less so that someone's attractive that makes them more likely to win, but that people vote based on attraction, which makes them more likely to win.
Yeah, and the effective attitude would essentially say that having an effective attitude isn't just a gut feeling, but it's also based on aesthetic qualities.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that, we're more likely, we'll talk about this more with attraction, but we're more likely to like people who are close and we engage with. But as long as those engagements aren't negative, if we've got a neighbor who doesn't shower,
Oh,
that's not going to make us like them more just because we see them every day.
right.
And that's part of that effective attitude, that we're making these judgments based on these kind of gut or aesthetic reactions. And it may be that who we perceive as more attractive. There was a study that found that out of these like 50 categories on what could predict presidents, they found that there were only two that were actually correlated, and that was height.
Mm-hmm.
So presidents tend to be a little taller, and the amount of books that they published. Which, to be fair, says nothing about your actual qualities of being a president,
Right.
or a good leader or anything. So we've got these sort of ways in which attitudes are formed, and then we also have kind of the types of attitudes that we hold beyond that. And these can be split up between implicit and explicit attitudes. So either, again, almost that gut response, we don't have a lot of thought into it. They're almost schema-based.
Mm-hmm.
Stereotypes might fall in line with these, into influencing these types of attitudes.
Highly culturally constructed.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to be influenced very heavily by a lot of thought. And in many cases, not even influenced by our own maybe intense cognitive understanding that we're agreeing with them. That
Mm.
we might just sort of nod our heads and go along, or, again, read that headline and just take it at face value. Or, if I'm interviewing someone, maybe interview person A over person B at random, as far as I seem, but it might be that maybe I feel more comfortable around person A.
Hmm.
And
So
again, this
basically
doesn't
what you
necessarily,
do, yeah, just what you fall back on, what your default is.
right. And it's kind of, it kind of gets us to what we'll eventually talk about when, when people say that, like, everyone's a little racist or
Hmm.
everyone's a little sexist. And it doesn't really, some people do take that as a personal attack. But what we should think about it, and how we should think about, especially implicit attitudes, is that they're more of a byproduct of the culture and
Hmm.
the sort of social system in which we live in than us.
Hmm.
These
It's not who you are when you're paying attention and you're being careful and you're being courteous. It's who you are when you're not thinking, when you're tired, when you're not like monitoring what you're saying and portraying
it's what
yourself how you
slips
want to
out.
be.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
when you can't exert that conscious control. It's sort of what slips out. And again, it might make you look really bad in that situation, but it is a bigger kind of damnation to the social system in which you live, of
Hmm.
the pressures, what other people have told you, what you've maybe agreed to in the past. But even if you don't agree with it now, it's still there. That knowledge is still
Hmm.
there.
Or stuff you don't even realize that you believe.
Right. Things that you've been influenced by very subtly. One of the ways in which I would argue, like, groups like the KKK and these groups like that have done a lot of recruiting, is to kind of tap into some of this, is to go to people and go, yeah, you're a disenfranchised white youth. You ever wonder why you can't get a job, or what's holding you back? Like, you have this potential. We all have this potential. And they're kind of tapping into some of those things because, yeah, you may have seen certain portrayals, like, hey, yeah, like, the people in the movies are like me, the people on TV are like me, these,
Hmm.
these prominent businessmen down on Main Street, they all kind of look like me but a little older. Why am I not doing as good as that? And then they
Hmm.
say, well, it's this other group.
It's this other group. You see your segregated neighborhoods and how theirs isn't taken care of? We're not going to talk about redlining, but they just don't take care of it because
Right.
that's
And
inherently.
and these sort of subtle things. And again, you could get caught up in that, and you're thinking about it not in terms of maybe something that because you explicitly agree that, like, there are problems in society, and that
Hmm.
poverty is an issue, and that people are struggling. And I had this great conversation with my dad where he was listing off these things that are kind of wrong, and I was like, you're there, like, that's
Right?
what you're. But then the blame shifted, and
Yes.
the blame kind of shifted, not because, I think maybe he's, like, explicitly espousing these things, but because he's got this long history in which he's grown up in environments where that's kind of what he was being told.
Hmm.
And they're very different than those explicit attitudes, those attitudes that we very consciously, willfully support and back up. um,
Right.
it's the difference, I would argue, between, I've been reading Ibram Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist, or I finished reading it. And one of the things that he talks about is there aren't really racist people. There are people with racist ideas,
Hmm.
and they are influenced by a system which helps perpetuate those ideas.
Right.
Um, and I don't know. I mean, we could probably have a full argument on whether or not that's 100% true, but there definitely is something there, that there are these social systems that lead people to these biased, implicit attitudes. And at their core, these aren't inherently bad people,
Hmm.
but it is a difference between that person who maybe lets something slip in a tweet versus the person who is only tweeting stuff like that.
Right. Well, I mean, that kind of going back to the redlining example, like you can grow up in any city in this country and see the difference in ethnic groups and the neighborhoods that they live in. And because that's all you've ever known, it's very normal. And it doesn't seem like that's been constructed, despite the fact that it has been explicitly constructed to do that. And so just your behavioral experiences, your affective experiences, will lead you to some racist ideas about those people based on the quality of those neighborhoods, despite lacking the knowledge that prior to that, redlining was a thing, keeping people out of housing loans was a thing, keeping people out of neighborhoods was a thing. And so it's very reasonable to accidentally become racist in this country if you just base it off of your day-to-day experiences.
Yeah, and again, like understanding some of these underlying things, it takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort, it takes textbooks that actually talk about it and don't
Yeah.
gloss over it. Um, I could add we already had a kind of YouTube video that should be watched to the podcast. Last week tonight, John Oliver just released at the time of this recording one on U.S. history,
Mm.
specifically talking about things like the Tulsa riots and things like that, where these things that we didn't hear about. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I got to attend my first Juneteenth ceremony, and I was like, "Oh, this is what Juneteenth is."
Surprise.
Surprise. I mean, especially learning that, yeah, it was all because it was when the US military finally came in and told people in Texas, you guys can't have slaves anymore 2 years after it was outlawed.
Right.
And again, we don't, what we're talking about and what we're exposed to and what we're reading has a lot of influence on our attitudes, even if we're not really paying attention to them. It leads me to pose the question, and I try to pose this to my students, and there's no right or wrong answer, I think, but
I
like
hate these.
people's tweets, are they implicit or explicit attitudes? I think it's different from an email. I think you have a little more time to construct an email, put some of your idea, unless you're sending off a very heated email. I've gotten some of those.
I think just based off of my own like behavioral attitudes about Twitter and Facebook, I'm such an old man when it comes to social media that I take a lot of time to like think about what I'm gonna write and then save it and come back to it and then post it. But I think it's probably more implicit for the vast majority of people because I think you just fire off a tweet. I don't think people like sit there and, you know, carefully fine tune what they're saying like they would in an email. I think probably the same can be said for text messages too. I think you put even less time thinking about um, a text message than you do a tweet versus an email.
And it's so easy to do it.
Hmm.
Um, I would kind of argue that they're probably both, depending on how you're approaching it.
Yeah,
But maybe
if
for
you
the
have a
average
Twitter
person,
thread going, yeah, that probably
yeah,
is more explicit.
yeah. If there's the person who's typing up a 4 or 5 dozen tweet thread, or someone who versus someone who like sees a hashtag and has to comment on it
Hmm.
and just kind of throws it out, or is just kind of saying whatever's the first thing that pops into their mind. I used this one tweet that this was post 9/11 tweet where this young guy saying, am I racist for being uncomfortable at this guy wearing a turban on this plane because it's not okay for me. And I'm like, that's a really tough question to ask.
Hmm.
Um, are you?
I mean, the fact that you're asking makes me think it's not explicit. But based on like our experiences with the media and, you know, people who are, you know, Islam and terrorism and 9/11, et cetera, that gets played over and over again, I'm sure that fear is very implicit based off of that cultural conditioning.
Right. And so that's what I started with. And I was recently recording. I've been using this tweet for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years now, just because I was like, this is what it says. And there's a guy, and he's got a regular generic white guy avatar. And
Hmm.
then I saw his ad name.
Oh no.
And so usually what I say, for like the first time I've ever done this, I think I've really cognitively noticed that at name. And it wasn't, again, it wasn't overtly, but it was one of those things where I say, if someone's saying this, maybe we should go look at their other tweets. There's a really
Right.
good TED talk on losing your job over one bad tweet. And I would argue in that TED talk, which I'll also add to the description of the video, or the podcast, that one TED talk, it's really easy to say that this woman probably didn't hold negative explicit attitudes based on the tweet that she made, based on her previous tweets, based on the circumstances, based on a number of things. I used to try to make that like, well, there's not a whole lot that we could learn with just one tweet. We have to look at this guy's history of tweets. His at name is Hard R. I'm not going to finish it, but that's how it starts. And I was like, is that a reference to the hard R racial slur
Oh.
instead of adding A to the end of it?
Oh.
And I went, oh, well, maybe I've just answered my question there.
There you go.
Is it implicit or it's probably a little explicit.
It's probably explicit. See, you were leading me down this because there's a postmodern idea that if you change the speed of something, then it fundamentally changes the thing. And that kind of falls in line if we're talking about writing, that if you speed up your writing very quickly, then you're going to change everything about that writing. And so I was like, okay, no, that's a nice little transition there. We can move from explicit motivations and attitudes with our slow writing, and then speed it up to get more into the implicitness of it. And then you threw me for a loop with that username.
Yeah, it seems to be very explicit. It's kind of like that, I'm not racist, but...
Oh.
And then there's something really terrible that's about to be said after.
Yeah, nothing good comes after that, but...
But what we're dealing with here is again, if we're talking about in a sort of a larger social system, that the part of the way in which these attitudes are disseminated come from what we're exposed to, and not everyone reacts the same way to everything. Not everyone recognizes the same things. I'm always really interested in reading these in-depth news articles on things like the symbols of a group, and these words or phrases that they might use, or these symbols that they adopt, that if I were just looking at these in any other context, I'd have no idea. But they've kind of crafted them, and just seeing those symbols can elicit certain responses, agreement, disagreement, whatever it may be. I mean, even stuff that's been co-opted by groups. It kind of gets us moving into the realm of things like propaganda, and like why memes can be so effective to spread hate.
Right.
Because we're not paying attention to them. And when we're not paying attention, much like the advertising example you used a couple of episodes ago with, influencing people to view bacon and eggs as a classic American breakfast. That's not trying to hit people where they're paying attention, where they're being cognitively aware of what's going on, where they're seeing that product placement being used, and they're viewing the context in which it's being used. They're falling prey to what we call kind of the peripheral route over the central route to persuasion, and that's kind of where a lot of the propaganda, or when you're trying to influence someone using something like a meme. This shift into what we'll talk about with insidious advertising, or insidious attitude change through persuasion. So you had in particular a really interesting article you found on this.
Yes, I did. So kind of in line with this periphery approach to persuasion and changing people's attitudes, very similar to the bacon and eggs, which I'll remind everyone was advertisements for bacon and eggs on the front page of a newspaper, along with an article with I think it was 5,000 or 6,000 doctors who said that having a high protein filling breakfast was ideal for medical and health benefits. And so you're getting the affect of, oh, I need to be healthy and safe so I can live long. I need to give my kids a good breakfast before they go to school, paired with the advertisements for high protein products in order to facilitate that. So you make the associative connection, you kind of have that affective pull there with wanting to be healthy. And so our 2020 iteration of this ties nostalgia to our product placement. And so this is an article by Well, Kang, and Schimmerbach from 2019. And what they tested was, so the way that this is framed and what inspired the study is the Friendiversary slideshow that Facebook puts out whenever you pass a date that you and your friend became, connected on Facebook. And so they show all of the pictures that you are both tagged in, statuses, stuff like that. So you kind of have this nostalgic trip down memory lane. It makes you feel good. You share it to your page. You tag your friend. Everybody likes it. Woohoo, social affirmation. So they wanted to look at what happens when you use this autobiographical memory, so memories about our lives, and pair it with advertising. And so we can get more personalized with our advertising now, rather than just, oh, you want to be healthy, eat bacon. Now we're actually looking at the emotions that are elicited while you're watching the slideshow, and then transferring those to the ads on the side of the page in order to feel better about those products. And so in the study, the researchers found that when you personalize the advertisements, you do get favorable reactions towards the advertisement and enhanced feelings of nostalgia. And you don't see an increase in perceived intrusiveness as long as the ad, like there's a difference between where the ad is and what the actual slideshow or nostalgia producing stimulus is, because they kind of outline that, like, I'm sure we've all experienced this. If you're talking about like, oh, I need to go get cat food, or oh, I watched this cool video on like bugling or something like that, and then all of a sudden your Facebook ads are cat food and bugles and bugle lessons, that makes people weird. They don't like that. So that's not necessarily an effective ad strategy to persuade someone to purchase your product, because it makes them feel like they're being intruded upon, that they're being surveyed. People don't like that. But if you can get those nostalgic feelings from the slideshow and transfer it within the same visual scape to ad placements on the sidebar, that's going to be a lot more successful in getting people to purchase those products later.
Makes me a little glad I'm not on Facebook anymore. But it also doesn't mean that it's not utilized in other ways.
Oh yeah, this happens all the time on like even YouTube, with ads that play in the middle of your videos. Trying to think where else might this occur. Sure, it happens on Twitter.
I mean, it's a byproduct of a lot of the, you know, standard advertisement. If you find a catchy tune or an upbeat slogan, you know, McDonald's tells you, you know, they're loving it, and they've got that nice little jingle, and so you're like, yeah, it's nice.
The happy red and yellow colors, you see
Right.
one all the time.
And it's tied to this idea of you're not cognitively thinking about it, because it's an advertisement. We don't really pay attention to those unless we are interested in it. You know, if I really want to buy a car, that's going to have less of an effect on me than the car commercial that is talking about safety and you know, awards that they've won, and showing the specs of the vehicle versus my usual fall to is the Kia gerbils, Kia hamsters commercial.
Oh yeah.
I never want people to forget about it, but I want to forget about it.
That was an effective ad campaign, and there's Kia Souls everywhere now.
And it was to essentially get people who didn't really want a car or weren't thinking about a car to kind of view upbeat music, something memey, something kind of weird and off-putting to an extent. We should come back to that when we talk about attraction and sexuality, because the male and female hamster characters in those ads were very different. Just things that keep me up at night.
I don't explicitly remember the male and female.
The male hamster characters look like hamsters. They were fat,
right.
They looked like hamsters. They were people in hamster suits, essentially.
Were the female hamsters like
they were women with hamster heads?
Oh,
they had very female bodies.
Okay.
Okay. At least in one or two of the ads. But yeah, but like, you're not supposed to pay attention to that advertisement. If you pay attention too much, it kind of loses its effect. It becomes a little too absurd. It becomes a little too off-putting.
Yeah. Getting existential about the Kia Soul commercials.
You know, it's an ad that I remember, because I remember one of them opened up with like a spaceship, and there was like a car running from like, you know, like an alien invasion almost. And I remember seeing it going like, I like a good sci-fi movie. What's this? And I remember it fooling me more than once, because I tried to forget about it afterwards. And then all of a sudden it would pull back and Party Rock Anthem would play, and then the hamsters would start dancing. And I was like, what is this? This isn't a sci-fi movie. I've been tricked. But I was paying
Alvin and the Chipmunks 7.
Oh, yeah. So it's definitely been one that stuck with me as a really good example of that kind of insidious
Mm-hmm.
advertisement. You're not meant to really pay attention to it. You're meant to be hooked on the music, or and then to have those, just have those associations sit in the back of your head. So 2 years later, when you're like, I'm gonna buy a
What
car.
kind of car do I want? Oh, look at Kia Soul. Those are cool.
Yeah, those are
That's
hip.
fun. So prepare yourself for the coming era of 2020, because advertisements are going to get a lot more personal, and they're going to be drawing on especially people who have long histories on Facebook, who've never deleted I've deleted my Facebook like 3 times, so they can't really get me that much. But for people who have had their Facebook page for over a decade now, like, they can start pulling some serious nostalgia points for
Yeah.
these advertisements now. So that's something to look, I don't want to say look forward to in the positive sense, but we should be aware of that our own autobiographical memories are about to be used against us in advertising.
And with an election year coming up, or always, there's always an election year coming up. They could be
We
something to think about too, because if advertisements become more and more insidious, more and more invasive,
hmm
hiddenly invasive, we might have to be more aware of that. I mean, it's part of where some of these memes and stuff. You have plenty of meme subreddits and online depositories where they're pumping out all of these Trump and Biden memes. And again, you might know nothing about either candidate, but based on what some of these memes, depending on what whether they're trying to push something positive or negative,
hmm
and that may subtly shape whether you want it or not. If you're not paying attention to it, may subtly shape what you feel about that particular candidate. Knowing
hmm
nothing about them, you might decide, oh, this is definitely true. It gets into the realm of conspiracy theory belief. It's tied heavily to some of these fear and non-cognitively aware persuasive techniques.
I just had a dystopic premonition of our Facebook memories getting combined with deep fake videos of political candidates for political advertising in the future,
I
and
mean, it
I'm
was just,
unsettled.
if we're talking about Facebook, it was just announced last week that they refused to pull another edited video that slowed down speech to make the Speaker of the House look drunk.
Oh,
And they're not pulling it down. And so, yeah, it's showing that you can post some stuff. You can post some
well,
stuff that's kind of on the edge. And as we get better and better with some of the, and this isn't even good technology. This is like really poorly done. Like, we're just slowing stuff
right,
down.
yeah, because I'm just thinking of like the basic like text chains that the Biden and Trump campaigns are sending out right now. If you've signed up for them, they mention you by name and they say, "Hey, this is Joe Biden. Thank you for your support. We're running on grassroots donations, so now's the time to pitch in before the FCC cutoff." And I'm like, "Ooh, that could be a deep fake."
And I mean, it can also be, I mean, on the other side of it, if it is real, it kind of taps us into that kind of like parasocial relationships
Yeah,
when
I
it
feel like
comes
Joe
to
Biden's not
advertising.
texting that to everyone who
No,
signed up.
well, no, I mean, but it could be part of his campaign, like his campaign staff are texting
hmm
these. But you could also be someone else's campaign staff saying, "You should donate to us by clicking on this link," and then it sends
hmm
the money elsewhere. There's no way for you to know.
One of the things that I thought was really effective, actually, kind of in this vein, was I was on the Bernie Sanders text chain, and I actually got real humans, like within my like phone area code, who were telling me about specific things going on in the community, that I like sign this petition for this business, or do this, or we're going out to do this at this time. And I was like, oh, I think this is real. They could not have been real, and it could have been excellent technology.
Yeah, there
Uh,
there definitely are some campaigns that have been using volunteers to text, and they'll kind
mhm,
of send out a message and say, "Hey, text this to, here's some people in your area on our text list. Text this
mhm.
to these people. Keep them updated when we send you something new." And it kind of involves a chain, and then those people could text it to others and so on, or share it on social media, and it does kind of create this grassroots effort that is real to an extent,
Right.
but
Yeah, no, I
very
thought that was,
powerful.
yeah, super. And like when I compare that to like the Joe Biden text messages that one of our mutual friends signed up for as a joke, um, the it's always written by Joe Biden. And I'm like, was it though? This feels weird. You mean there's viruses in my computer? That's what it makes me think of. I'm like, oh,
Right, right. Where yeah, it's definitely someone pretending to be a tech support rep from Microsoft, and they're
yeah, it's
totally
just a bot.
totally a level 8 tech supporter, staff from Microsoft. That,
I'm like, I don't know if this is going to convince anyone. Like, getting a text message from like Crystal, who lives in my town and wants me to go help canvas with her at this time at this street.
and I mean, part of that too is how like things like persuasion and attitudes can be more effective. The more you can make your self seem, or the more you are a kind of real, legitimate source. I mean, there's a whole side what goes into the Yale attitude change approach. We'll never get done if we go into it too. But things like people like us, we're more likely to be persuaded by someone who isn't in their 70s. So, I mean, if Joe Biden or Donald Trump is texting us, we're gonna be like, it's that kind of boomer alert going off.
Right.
It'd be like our parents texting us and be like, you should vote for this person. We'd be like, I love you guys, but you're not the kind of, I'm not going to take all my advice from you anymore. But yeah, that versus someone who's closer to us, that's closer to our age, that's in our area. And we even see this on the fake side. Fake bot accounts tend to use avatars that make them look like they're supposed to, or part of a particular group, or they use American flag avatars or something like that. And then even, I kind of made a crack about these fake tech scams. They have scripts that they work off of that are tied to hit people who know absolutely nothing about how Microsoft works, but to make themselves seem believable that they were a rep from Google or Microsoft or Norton Antivirus or whoever. And it's a way to tap into those aspects of what is effective persuasively.
That's something that happens on dating apps all the time. So pretty much bots have taken over the dating apps. They're just everywhere.
Did you hear that Match and its subsidiary has been sued
because of that?
And they're about to get hit by the FCC because they
Huzzah!
willingly knew that there were bots and scams sending messages, and they were just like, we'll let it go through because the only way you can really see what this person is saying is to sign up for our service. And it's borderline fraud is what they're arguing. And so yeah.
Oh yeah, no, Tinder, Bumble, Grinder, they're all full of bots, and you can always tell who's the bot because they're like the prettiest person who's real is probably a 9 on the 10-point scale. These bots are like 11s. Like, it's out of place. The picture is always too good, and they're always too ripped or too busty or too whatever. And so they kind of overplay their hand in that sense. And so, I mean, I guess they pick up people who are not used to dating apps. So like newbies are more likely to fall for it than people who've been on for a while. But that's always amusing. You pull it up, and I'm like, there's no way that people that look like this are living in Commerce, Texas.
I mean, there might be someone out there, but are they on those apps?
Probably not.
So this kind of takes us into some other forms of advertising that we kind of have written down. These is very different than what we might see with, and we were talking about this before we started recording on how confusing certain YouTube ads are. Because in these cases, they're when you pay for a YouTube ad, you can decide where you want those ads to some degree. You could say, I want them on this type of video, or maybe these particular types of videos. And sometimes, you're watching a video, a particular type of video, and you see something that's almost the antithesis of what should be on that video. Advertisements that are almost directly opposite from what might be, and sometimes really long advertisements. So it's another YouTube video on top of this YouTube video you're trying to watch.
So you get something like you're following sassy socialist comebacks, and then all of a sudden there's a PragerU advertisement, and it's just the whole PragerU video right in the middle of this video about socialism. And you're like, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah, and even stuff that's you have people making commentary about certain types of people. Like, PragerU ads, and
Mm-hmm.
you'll see PragerU ads for that. Or you mentioned recently I mean, you're also in North Texas, so bombarded with Donald Trump ads. I mean,
Right. Yeah,
some
I
of
get
them are
his.
regional.
Yeah, they do it regionally. No, I get the survey all the time. Is like, tell Donald Trump what you think about those liberals and socialists.
And
And
I've
I'm
gotten
like,
some of those before too, but I'm not in. I think I got them a lot more when I was in Southern Louisiana than where I am now.
uh-huh.
But I'd still get them, but it wasn't for everything. So I'd watch like a speed run, which I've been really into lately, and no, not a whole lot of that. But then I'll watch something, some commentary, and I'll get them. And
Mm-hmm.
so, some of these targeted ads I think are trying to target certain groups or certain people, or maybe people are kind of on the fence. It also makes me wonder too if some of these ads are very explicitly targeting um, to kind of get some of that outrage to, or
Right.
maybe it's just maybe they think that they are. There was I remember there was a YouTuber who was talking about their content, some of their like life history, and this was someone who used to be a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Uh-huh.
And I've seen other people talk about, if they're talking about, there's a couple of people who talk about like pseudoscience and multi-level marketing and, things like essential oils and stuff. And they get there are also other videos that they do that tend to be more like um, atheist oriented. So they talk about kind of their experience or them, growing up. They have a lot of videos that are very heavily religiously themed, or
Mm-hmm.
you'll have like Jehovah's Witnesses videos specifically targeting these people talking about you know skeptic circles, or even talking about like their history, why they're not a part of the church anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of interesting looking at it specifically, them talking about how they're getting these targeted ads, because it's sometimes hard to tell, like, are they doing it because like they know it might bother the person, or are they doing it because maybe in this case they really think they might pick up some interested people, like, hey, this person's talking about it, why don't you come and hear our side of the story? And
Right. Yeah,
that
and you
may
kind of
be that may
attack
be a more
that both
effective way.
sides kind of mentality.
And that may be a more effective way to approach it. But some of these I think are almost, it almost seems like a trolling form of advertisement.
And
They're
this
like, I
happens.
know the viewers of this show are gonna hate seeing this at the beginning. They're gonna complain about it, and they're gonna
Mm-hmm.
tweet about it, and then next thing you know, I'm getting free advertisement.
Mm-hmm. This happens a lot with like lifestyle vloggers, particularly ones that are particularly gay. They'll start getting anti-gay, homophobic ads for organizations and stuff in the middle of their videos. And so that could be a part of this outrage advertising. Um, because usually it's either outrage advertising or it's targeting people who are creating cringe compilations with those videos, or people who are hate watching
Yeah.
lifestyle
So
vlogs.
if you already want to watch it because you want to find something to leave a nasty comment on,
Mm-hmm.
that ad's for you.
Right, because I mean, Google knows who puts in a bunch of comments and who's the hate watcher and who's not.
Yeah, it's really interesting way. I mean, it is kind of almost a version of like what we were talking about in terms of like woke
Mm-hmm.
advertising, where you're kind of engaging in almost purposely infuriating ads in order to stir up getting people to talk about it more, or maybe attracting certain people, different
Mm-hmm.
markets. It's not for the average viewer, but it's for that subset. And if you don't have to pay a lot for the ad, that subset might be all you need to hit.
Right. So examples of this would be like the Colin Kaepernick ad for Nike,
Like,
Mikey, who's that? Or the Gillette toxic masculinity ad. Like that's super affirming for a specific group of people, but the real benefit of those ads was the overall cultural conversation and outrage that it stirred in the first place.
every news station picked it up.
The
Every
president of
person,
the United States started tweeting about it.
every person who was offended by it talked about how they were a Gillette customer for 20 years and now they're throwing their razors away. These great razors that they use every day and last forever. in the trash.
in
And
the
they're
trash.
tweeting it out for the world to see.
And people who don't care go, wow, that must have been a really great razor. And you're just triggered.
Right. Yeah. Like, oh, look at this person. But hey, they actually said that they've been using this for 20 years. Maybe. Or it lets other people know, hey, wait, what's this controversy on Gillette? Let's talk about it. I
Mm-hmm.
want to hear it from someone.
So you pay a small fee for your advertisement, and then everybody else does it for free. And it works, obviously. Gillette had a 3.6 increase in net sales after that ad, and Nike saw an even bigger bump. Let me see if I can pull it up. My screen froze a little bit. I believe it was like 30% or something like
Something
that.
like between 20 and 30%.
Yeah, 31%.
More.
After that Kaepernick ad. So these actually work. If we want to get a little more insidious, you can also see instances. I didn't find the brand name for this, but there's one of those delivery boxes, like the mystery box that you get once a month.
Loot,
And
like
it's,
loot boxes, loot crate, stuff
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, except makeup specifically. And they did one for Pride Month, and they had a line in there that this woman was like, I'm a lesbian, and attraction to women is a spectrum, and like I'm attracted to authentic cis women and trans women. And that caused out like controversy in the very group that they were targeting, which was then followed back by the super corporate cheesy, we're so sorry, we missed the mark, we're going to do better, we're going to put out some videos educating people about LGBT issues, thank you for being a part of the family, and we look forward to blah 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 blah. Like, it was really bad, but they also saw an increase because they were able to spark an outrage, even if it's in that specific demographic that's probably they're trying to affirm. They can still outrage that group and still see their revenue go up.
Yeah, and there was an argument to be had when this was becoming really prominent, because there were a lot of companies kind of doing this, or at least starting to maybe kind of put their foot in the water with some of this, much in the same way that like when Wendy's became sort of memey on Twitter, there were a lot
Oh.
of brands that kind of followed suit and tried to be hip and edgy and just one of the kids.
Mm,
But we can see something similar, and there was an argument that is likely we're going to start seeing stuff like this, where you're going to have companies that purposely push buttons, purposely put stuff in, purposely have their executives say stuff that is controversial just so that it could be talked about
mm-hmm.
for free advertising.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. And the thing with Wendy's too is there's also a parasocial relationship there that's really gross. Like, I felt like the Wendy's meme moment really took parasocial relationships to the next level. So this idea that you have a relationship with someone that's not reciprocated, because it's a corporate entity with a bunch of people working on that Twitter account.
Yeah, it's
Where
very
you're
different than like a kind of parasocial relationship with maybe like a YouTube celebrity, where
mm-hmm,
there could at least be some back and forth. I mean, in terms of maybe reading comments, or responding to like if you're on Twitch, responding to someone donating, answering
mm-hmm,
questions, being very frank and upfront, or maybe addressing a fan who says like, hey, you helped me through a hard time in my life, and they're like I really appreciate that. They address them specifically, and you do have a lot of, I think, more genuine. There's plenty of non-genuine people who use this, but that's also very different than
yeah,
a megacorp,
anthropomorphizing your logo.
right?
And then walking her around like a edgy zoomer on Twitter.
Pretending to be Wendy when you're really Dave Thomas.
Dave and Fred and the whole team is here, the whole PR team.
Right. Yeah, it's much like there's been a new thing, and it's gained a lot of traction. They've also gotten a lot of flack with the I don't know if you've seen anything about the Army esports team.
Yeah,
So they're directly connected, whether they want to pretend to be or not, to Army recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become kind of insidious because they were doing things like an Xbox giveaway that was linking directly to the Army recruitment page. And if you're a
Ah.
14-year-old on Twitch watching them stream games, and there do seem, I mean, there are, I would argue, genuine people in the Army who would love to participate in esports and kind of rep,
Mm-hmm.
this group that they're a part of, that they feel really strongly about. But you have to go through recruitment training before you can do it. And it's all tied in part very heavily to, and the Army's got a long history of this, of backing video games and sponsoring movies.
Movies. Oh yeah, like every Marvel movie ever.
Transformers.
Transformers. Yeah, Transformers
That's
was
the big
another
one.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Army's in it. They're in a prominently positive light, and they allow the producers of the movies to use Army equipment, authentic uniforms, authentic, tanks and jeeps and all of that stuff. And in the same way that they were helping to subsidize aspects of the NFL to do these kind of flyovers and halftime shows,
Mm-hmm.
the military helps with that. And again, there's some insidious aspect of that because we kind of build this association without realizing that this stuff is going on behind the scenes.
And we're paying for it too.
Right. We're paying for them to help pay, these other companies to then advertise back at us. And yeah, it is arguably, especially with some of the stuff, because they were really hitting on this kind of meme Zoomer-esque. I really don't like using generational names. As someone who is in that year that is right between millennial and Gen Xer, when I was born, I hate using it because I feel like I'm not part of both.
Right. Well,
And Gen
I'm
Xers
a
are
pretty.
ignored. Gen Xers are ignored anyway. So.
Yeah, I know. And I'm like a solid millennial internet user too. Like, and there's a big difference, like just like 2 years below me on people who use the internet. Like, it's astonishing.
Yeah. But yeah, that this type of kind of unaware, and this all really relates back to that kind of unaware advertising that we're exposed to, but
Mm-hmm.
we don't really pay attention to, and you're getting people to talk about it more, or maybe it does make us pay attention. In this case, it is making people pay attention, but to be outraged, and then to spread the word, so that the people who are against you are suddenly going to start buying their product, and then 3 or 4 years from now they'll run an all-inclusivity campaign and they'll reverse the trend, and so they're constantly flipping back and forth. This kind of to add yet another recommendation video on this is H Bomber Guy's Woke Brands video is another really good one that gets into a lot of the heart of how it can be really hard to tell the level of genuineness in some of this, or if these brands are trying to, they're out to make money. It's a company.
Yeah.
And so
they're genuinely out to make money. And that's kind of, we talked about this a little bit. I didn't put this in earlier, but that's like the Peter and Ashley Coffin's Adversary series, which goes into very like specific ads and, kind of looks at how they're using woke culture and cancel culture in order to get free advertising and increase sales, and manipulating that social environment to make money like they do.
It's the new way to generate hype. Stuff that maybe early advertisers, if they could have found ways to do this more effectively, but some of the early ones did. You go back to the 1930s, 1940s ads for Listerine, where the guy who took over the company was like, we're hemorrhaging money. How are we going to do this? How are we going to get people to buy our mouthwash to help with dental care? Wait a second. If your breath isn't good, you're never going to have a relationship.
Yep.
And so halitosis became a thing. It became a thing that, people were concerned about it before, but far less concerned about it than they were when the marketing campaign came out for it, to get people to talk about and to think much more. We think about that in relation of shaving and what is it, the No Shave November, and how men are treated versus women are treated for No Shave November. If you don't shave your legs or your armpits, you're a very different, it's okay if you're a guy.
Oh yeah, no, you're disgusting if you're a woman.
And again, a lot of that is tied to the need to sell razors.
Yeah. And they will even, like, it takes it to the point, like, I don't know if you're aware of the pink tax.
Yes.
Yeah, the pink tax. So if the product is pink, it's going to cost more. Because if you've already got your consumer base treating your product like a necessity, then you can charge more for it.
Right. Because you need it. You need to shave. You
Mm-hmm.
need to stay. I mean, on one hand, like, is coming from a guy with a usually unkempt beard, but at least a full beard,
At least a full beard.
not some half beard,
Yeah, it's not a neck
that
beard.
I'm not keeping unkempt. That yeah, like there's still, there's still a need to keep up with it to some extent, because I'm expected to. It's been really interesting thinking about that, and maybe we'll talk about this at some point with conformity as well,
Mm-hmm.
of how a lot of those attitudes have changed very drastically in times of pandemic. There are a lot of people who aren't shaving anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, haircut's one thing. Like, if you want to trust someone with your hair, like, I don't even trust myself with my hair. So it's been getting long, but I still kind of keep up with my beard.
I think this is a perfect teaser for next week's video, or I guess podcast, because we're going to talk all about hair.
Hair and social
Yep.
and social perception. So how we perceive hair, with our first special guest.
Huzzah! We'll wait for it to be a surprise.
Yeah, it's not two white guys talking about hair.
Yeah, I know. We're going to cover
From a
some
non-white
topics that
perspective.
we need a little bit more of a perspective to talk about.
So this can also help us get into our last topic, because we're probably getting long again.
We always get long.
Um,
That's what we do.
the last thing I want to talk about is kind of not attitude change from others, but attitude change from ourselves. And so let's say we are a couple of white guys, and we want to talk about perceptions of ethnic hair.
Mm-hmm.
There's this feeling that we might get when we come to this awareness that maybe we are not the best people to talk about
Mm-hmm.
ethnic hair. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about afros or dreadlocks or anything that's not,
Yeah.
white hair. And what that does, and let's say we did decide to do it, which we're not,
What?
bringing a guest in. If we did decide to do this, it might create some discomfort that we have to deal with. We have to rationalize in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we could be like that panel. I'll see if I can find a picture of it at some point. But this news panel that was talking about women in the workforce, and it was 5 old white guys sitting around a
Right.
news test talking about that. We could just go, "Yeah, we're experts on it." Like,
We've
we're the
been in
social
the
psychologists in the
workforce.
room.
We
can do
know
it.
women.
Right? We have talked to them before.
In
One
the
of us is married
workforce.
to one.
I have a daughter. I don't have a daughter, but
So we can come to we can try to rationalize it, and so this takes us to cognitive dissonance. This kind of attitude change through our own behavior, and so this actually becomes, I mean, it's argued to be one of the most powerful forces in social psychology, if not maybe one of the most powerful motivators, at least social psychologists would argue, for human behavior. That when we are confronted with something that goes against our typically positive self-image. So we like to see ourselves as intelligent, moral, upstanding, good individuals, and that's usually for
we're
the best.
always
I mean,
right.
most people are, for the most part, in their 99% of their 90% of their 75% of their day-to-day lives.
Except when they're on Twitter.
That we typically try to do the right thing. The average person does. We're not out. I mean, the average person, despite, again, our perception of crime, the average person is more pro-social than they are criminal.
Mm-hmm.
We try to do the right thing. We try to take the right path. We try to come to the right decisions. We try to understand our world the right way. But we don't always do this. It's kind of the same with some of the stuff that we've already talked about with automatic processing and effective attitudes.
Sometimes we check out and do something dumb.
And we have to confront that. My favorite example of this, because we were talking about Transformers earlier, is I remember I was working on my master's degree. I was working two jobs at the time. I had little money to spend on a lot of extraneous things, and we had a date night, and we went and saw Transformers 2.
Mm-hmm.
It was the worst date night.
I mean, you went to see Transformers.
But I remember, so I didn't pay. I mean, I paid like night showing,
Right.
and we got concessions. And
Oh,
so,
Lord.
you drop $30 as a broke graduate student. Like, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I remember going to see this movie, and I remember getting out of the movie, and I remember spending a week trying to rationalize why it was an all right movie. I learned
Ah.
more about Transformers lore in that week than I think I ever have before and since.
Oh man.
Just trying to be like, why did they choose this? Why was this in the movie? Why was this a thing? Until eventually I was kind of told by my lovely wife that it was just a terrible movie. I need to admit it. And so I finally took that hit to my self-esteem and went, yep, I like to see myself as a smart person. Smart people don't make dumb decisions. Smart people don't waste their money. But I totally wasted my money.
Totally wasted your money.
And part of that, though, is that cognitive dissonance. There's this like guilty negative reaction that's inside of me, in the same way that if I say, like, hey, look, good people go to class all the time. Good people go to work. I'm a good employee. I go to work, but then I call in sick and I'm not really sick. Or I take a day off from class. I skip class, but I'm not really sick.
Mm-hmm.
I have to deal with that. And it's easy. I mean, some things are really easy for us to do. Like, there are other people going to be there. I can rationalize why it's going to be okay. The company will survive without me for a day.
Oh, I'm sure.
Whatever it may be. Or that student saying, look, I'll catch up. I'll be able to do it. And that usually gets us through. We're able to rationalize it. But what we find is that the more and more we do that, the more it changes our attitudes and makes it more acceptable for us to skip work or to quit. Or it makes our work seem less enjoyable because we keep having to leave and skip out on it. Or if I have to keep rationalizing and I never do take that hit to my self-esteem, I start to really love Transformers too. And again, if you do, that's fine. It's perfectly fine to love any movie, good, bad, and in between. Plenty of people like really bad movies. There are plenty of really bad movies. But part of how we kind of form these decisions on what is good, what is bad, what a person who likes it, what a person who doesn't, it taps into what we think about ourselves. And the more and more we do it, the more we start to change aspects of self-schema, of attitudes towards those things. And this is all related to, this is my favorite line. This is what I teased last time. Wait till the end of the podcast. My favorite line in all of psychology to say in any class. So Leon Festinger wanted to do this study. And Leon Festinger is the lead researcher who helped develop cognitive dissonance theory that kind of explains all of this. And my favorite line, Leon Festinger had his graduate students infiltrate a cult. And if I can have a line in psychological history, just half, I'll take a tenth as good as that, I think I'll be satisfied with my life as a psychologist. I don't think I can ethically have my graduate students infiltrate a cult. And this wasn't necessarily like a doomsday cult, though they did believe the world was going to end. It was led by this very charismatic woman who felt that aliens were going to come and save them. These aliens were going to save them, and the world was going to be destroyed. They were going to go to some utopia. And it
sounds very Heaven's Gate.
Yes, it does, except that they didn't have to kill themselves for it.
Good.
There was no suicide involved. It was definitely they're just going to take us up on their ship. And so when Festinger, they kind of learned about this and they were working on, well, how do people deal with events that directly, and not something like, I have to kind of perceive that this movie was bad, or I choose a hamburger over a salad and I have to justify, maybe I'm trying to lose weight, but I pick the hamburger anyway. I have a cheat day. That's how I justify it. How do I justify doing this? It's a very explicit contradiction to what you believe, to what your attitudes are. And these people had a very specific event that was supposed to happen on a very specific day. And I'm just going to pick a random, it'll be like May 12th. Supposed to happen May 12th. So Festinger has his students get to know some of the cult members. They eventually get to meet the cult leader. They show interest in joining. And so they start hanging out with them. And they start going along with, keeping a journal saying, hey, this is what happened. I had this conversation with, Jim, the other cult member, Jane, the other cult member. And what Festinger wanted to see is what happens on May 13th.
Right.
May 12th, the world is supposed to end. And there are great accounts that have parodied this. If you want to see, my personal favorite is the Parks and Recreation Cult of Zorp. Because there's an entire episode where these cultists book the local park, and the world is going to be destroyed by this giant, like bone lizard, skeleton, and it's going to just destroy them all. And they're like, well, you have to pay the deposit on the park. And they're like, it's all right. Can I write it for tomorrow? And then the next day happens and they consult the text, the holy text, which is this like self-help book written by some guy who ran an office supply store.
It's always a self-help book.
and then they're like, oh, we read it wrong. It's supposed to happen in October. And then they're like, well, October, the park is booked for an ice cream festival. Oh, October 4th, 5th, 6th, until they finally found a date. Well, that's actually what happened in the Festinger study is that so the cultists are now confronted with, it's May 13th, the world hasn't ended. And the cult leader comes out and says, we were wrong. We've been spared 6 months. October, November, this day. That's when the world is actually going to end. The aliens, the beings that were going to save us, they actually stopped the world from ending. Incidentally, this has happened. This keeps happening time and time again. Mm-hmm. Maybe we just don't lecture on this enough. 2012 was supposed to happen. It was supposed to be the end of the world. I'm
not convinced that it didn't end.
Yes. Well, there are some people. There are some events that have happened since 2012. and that what happened is that the really hardcore like Mayan calendar conspiracy theory, the world is going to end, said, well, actually, if you read the Mayan calendar a certain way, 2012 is actually, 10 years later.
Oh,
they pushed the date back so they can keep kind of holding at least some of them. Some of them are going to have to come to terms and realize, well, maybe I'm in a cult. Maybe this isn't a good thing. And that's usually what happens when people are confronted with these situations, is that they feel this dissonance and they have a choice to make. They can go along with it and maintain that level of self-esteem, or they take that hit. And usually it's something extreme. It's something that really shakes their worldview. We see this with some cults as well, that people who break away. It takes a lot, because in a lot of cases, some of those cults are also instilling behavioral conditioning and other effects that are making it really hard to accept that dissonance.
Like isolation, like getting you removed from your family and friends and outer support group.
Right. So even if you want to get away, you almost can't. There was another good example of this that happened, and I remember it was one of the first summers I got to teach. And that summer, the rapture was supposed to happen. I think this was like summer 2012, 2013. I'm seeing if I could find the specific date. Is it Harold Camping? 2011. End Times prediction. He was a radio host, Harold Camping. He actually passed away in 2013. But he ran this kind of Christian radio network. During 2011, he predicted the end times. He said that the rapture was supposed to happen, and he, based on reading Revelations and aspects of the Bible, he ended up like getting this van and kind of like toured the U.S. He had people give money to him. There was actually one family I remember reading a story about who basically, they were expecting, they sold their house.
Oh no.
And gave him all of their money to like continue preaching the word, because like they wanted to get this message out. Like this was, for them, it was serious. So again, like if someone you trust is telling you the world's going to end, give me your money so I can go and spread the word. And what's really interesting, if you go back, he had been predicting since like 94. I think he had done some of his first predictions. But he said that the rapture would occur on May 21st. That massive earthquakes would happen across the world at 6 p.m. and that the end of the world would take place 5 months later on October 21st. We're here. It's 2020. This wasn't even like 2012 Mayan predictions. But it, obviously didn't happen. But part of it took him until the next year to finally admit that he was mistaken. And that the dates were pushed back and other things. There were other excuses and stuff like that. His reaction was taken seriously by some people. His reaction was not taken seriously by some people. And it really kind of mirrored this, because remember talking about cognitive dissonance when these predictions were starting, and I was like, all right guys, like this day's coming up, let's see what happens, because if we learn from previous research and Festinger's studies, we should see very similar things. We should see these instances where if the people are going to have to confront are they, still going to hold to these ideas, these things that they've been taught, these attitudes that they've formed, these beliefs that they have, or are they going to change them in some way? And what we tend to find, what Festinger tend to find, is it can be really tough to change them, especially as we get older.
Right.
Going back to advertising, that's why that 18 to 25 age bracket is the most sought after, because that's when our attitudes are the most malleable. We're getting some individual freedom, but we haven't had those attitudes long enough to where they become stable and much harder to break down.
Wow. We're just constantly at threat between cults and capitalism, huh?
But how we can get over it, and that this is an important part, we can overcome it with just some cognitive intervention.
Right.
By being aware of these processes, by thinking about them. And when it comes to our own self-esteem, we also tend to overestimate how much we're going to lose, how long we're going to lose it. We tend to bounce back pretty quick. At least that's what, for the most part, that's what research tends to show. Is we tend to bounce back, fairly quickly. Losing a job isn't the end of the world. Eventually we bounce back and we're like, there'll be other, might be difficult for us for a while, but the same thing with something like a breakup or, again, leaving a group that we've given a lot of money to or we've supported, can really reinforce those attitudes towards it. So I don't want to necessarily end on a dour note, but
what's our bias of the week?
That's what I want to end on.
Huzzah!
Our bias of the week is bias number. It's line 93 of the document. Parkinson's law of triviality.
Ooh.
This goes back to a researcher, and he's not initially a psychological researcher. He was I'm trying to find it. He was a British naval historian.
Nice.
And he actually has two. He has Parkinson's law that says that a job will always expand to meet the time allotted for it.
Oh.
That eventually we'll get it done, but it'll keep expanding until we finally finish it. And that's kind of where Parkinson's law of triviality comes from. It's an observation that he had about how humans can so involve themselves with details and minutia, trivial things, that they let crucial matters and crucial important issues go unattended.
So like how I keep doing my homework and not writing my dissertation.
Right. One is more important, or that you keep taking time out of your week to do a podcast.
Right. I keep cleaning my house, but my dissertation doesn't get longer.
But also things like a group gets so involved discussing the causes and minor details of the problem that no actual solutions show up for the problem at hand. If you ever get the pleasure of sitting on a university committee,
yes,
the law of triviality, it hits a little too close to home. And this was first published in 1958, so it's not a new concept.
It's
and again,
fairly
it's one of those
stable.
concepts maybe we should talk more about.
Right.
Maybe we should focus on the big issues instead of maybe some of the little issues, like how we're going to get people back to school eventually. How can we do it safely? Can we do it safely?
Should we try?
Maybe not, not just fight about, we should. Part of it does include some of the little fights that people are having over this, but yeah, the law of triviality. And maybe that's kind of what we do here in this podcast. We talk about all the little things instead of maybe the big stuff that you can go read in the textbook. You should probably read the textbook.
Yeah, definitely read the textbook. As a reminder, this is best paired with the textbook.
It's like a fine wine paired with a good meal.
Yes,
Or
except it's
cheap
rambling
paired with a good meal. And on that note, I think we can call it quits for the night.
Yes.
Our next episode, we're going to get into social perception and how people, we're going to theme it entirely on how people perceive hair with our special guests. So we're going to talk about beards. We're going to talk about long hair. We're also going to talk about non-white hair.
Mm-hmm.
And how that's perceived, especially among states that still have laws in place that allow employers to fire people if they do not have quote unquote traditional hair.
And we're going to get really intersectional with this because we're also going to look at it from another culture's perspective as well.
Yes. Yeah, and I've got some stuff. I've got some particular stuff on beardedness that goes cross cultural. So how Germans view it, how Europeans versus Americans view it.
Cool.
So, all right. So I look forward to that. So with that, we will bid you adieu. Have a good one.
Goodbye.